You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Shatton. My guest today is Marty Latz. Marty is an author, international speaker, and the founder of LATZ Negotiation. Latz has taught lawyers and business professionals around the world how to negotiate more effectively. Latz received his law and negotiation training at the Harvard Law School and was a teaching fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where one of his students was former President Barack Obama. Latz also negotiated for the White House on the White House advance teams. Marty is the author of Gain the Edge, Negotiating What You Want, and The Real Trump Deal, an eye-opening look at how he really negotiates. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Marty Latz. Marty, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
So you've become this go-to person on Trump as a negotiator. So in Art of the Deal, Trump says, "My style of deal making is quite simple and straightforward. I'm aim very high, and then I just keep pushing and pushing and pushing to get what I'm after." And this is a quote that you'll see all over the place in terms of Art of the Deal. I thought maybe we start with that. To what extent do you think is that a fair representation of Trump or not? And then I guess to take this from a broader perspective, how do you think of Trump as a negotiator just from a high level?
Great. Well, first of all, let's dissect that quote, because what Trump is talking about in Art of the Deal in that particular respect relates to what I call your offer concession strategy. It's one of what I call the five golden rules of negotiation, the fourth one being design an offer concession strategy. And Trump, in that respect, as he articulates it in Art of the Deal, has been pretty consistent over the years. I did an analysis of over 100 Trump negotiations in business over his 40 plus years in business, and he is extremely aggressive. He does aim very high. He is, and he is very, very focused on pushing and pushing. He does not always get what he wants, which is somewhat inconsistent with what he has been saying recently about his negotiation skills. But he is certainly extremely aggressive, not only in his offer concession strategies in terms of where he starts, where he moves, but also in terms of his goal setting. One of the things I found in my research that he did particularly effectively was he really reached for the sky with his goals, and where other people would never even think of asking for that or going for it, he was extremely aggressive, and in some cases, he actually achieved it. Perhaps example number one being, who would have thought when he first announced for president that he even had a chance of winning, but he won, and now he's our president. So let's unpack a little bit of this. So in negotiation, we think of two different fundamental types, right? You think of distributive negotiations and integrative. Distributive negotiations are the win-lose negotiations. That would be something over, for example, price. If I buy a table from somebody off of Craigslist, it's going to be distributive. Really, we're just going to have one item that we're going to be negotiating over, and that's price. If I pay a little bit more, then my counterpart receives that. If I pay a little bit less, then I receive those benefits. And then you have integrative negotiations where there's multi-item. So if it was going back to the desk example or table example, maybe we're negotiating on price as well as delivery date. And maybe we're also setting interest rates. So maybe we have three different arm level things that we're going to negotiate. I think of Trump very much as a distributive negotiator. And our tactics are different if we're doing distributive or integrative negotiations. And Trump... Well, they should be different.
Yeah, right. No, it should be different. But I think of Trump, and I want to see if this is your conception as well, as being a classic distributive negotiator across all forms of negotiation, whether it's distributive or integrative. And it's that I aim high and then higher and then higher and then higher on all items, kind of missing some of the benefits that you would get from integrative negotiations when there are multi-items and you're able to have concessions and mutually advantageous moves.
No, I think that's very accurate. I do find him to be an extremely distributive, I call it competitive strategies, super duper aggressive in that regard. And super duper aggressive in regards to issues that are not only zero sum in nature, as you articulate, $1 more for one side is $1 less for the other side, but also super aggressive where it really is counterproductive to be super aggressive, where there's a future relationship involved between the parties from a business perspective, where there are multiple, if not hundreds of issues on the table. In Donald Trump's world and in his negotiation mindset, it's all zero-sum, win-lose adversarial. In fact, the first chapter of my book, The Real Trump Deal, an eye-opening look at how he really negotiates, is Trump's instinctive win-lose mindset. That is how he sees the world in a very zero-sum adversarial distributive way.
Yeah, and so one of the costs of having that mindset to negotiation is that money gets left on the table. And for most people who are not familiar with negotiation, there's this idea that it's like war, and where your goal is to just wipe out the other part. And that's almost never the case, right? We think of, in negotiations, we think of you're not an opponent, but a counterpart. And so almost always you have overlapping issues that there'll be mutual gain if you can expand that pie. So I guess the technical phrase for that would be Pareto optimality. And the goal is to expand the pie in most negotiations so that both sides could potentially benefit. Of course, you're representing your own interests, but to the extent that you can expand the pie and simultaneously maneuver yourself to take more of the pie, it's to your advantage instead of just slashing and burning. So in your research, have you come across kind of the split and maybe the effects of the Trump distributive win-lose approach to negotiations, and how does that affect his own interests?
Well, Donald Trump doesn't live in the integrative world. He is highly competitive, has been ever since he was very, very young, and he got involved in sports. And it comes at a very significant cost. It doesn't only come at a cost in terms of dollars and cents and not being able to grab a slice of that bigger pie. It also comes at a significant cost in terms of his business relationships. Because even while he has been the consummate salesman in some contexts, he always views his quote unquote counterparts as the enemy. And when you do that, even when you do deals with them, you have such a level of distrust, and it is such an adversarial world that ultimately, if there's any problem or challenge in the partnership, it becomes a blame game and it blows up. And you've seen that on a consistent basis in Donald Trump's business partnerships, starting in the late 1970s, early 1980s, where the partnerships just on a regular basis blow up. And even employees that have been crucial to his success end up getting involved with him in litigation later on because he doesn't value that to any great degree. He might say it, but when you take a look at what he actually does in relation to those partnerships, you'll see that he doesn't really internalize or value those relationships at all. Comes at a great cost.
If I were to give the best case or the best defense of Trump as a negotiator, I would point to the Trump Tower negotiation. And in that, and this is laid out in great detail in Art of the Deal, Trump does some work that seems to be missing in a lot of his modern negotiations. So I think of his off-the-ball work. So he's multi-tracking, working on several pieces of the negotiation at once. He's increasing his potential, kind of working through limiting his counterparts. And we see a really sophisticated negotiator in the Trump Tower deal. And I wanted to kind of hand that off to you and see, what do you think about how he approaches Trump Tower, and then we'll start getting into some of the other deals that he does.
Yeah, I would actually. I think there are two significant business negotiations that I think he did particularly effectively. Trump Tower was one of them, and the other was the redevelopment of the Commodore Hotel in New York, which is now the Grand Hyatt next to Grand Central Station. In both of them, a young Donald Trump did his homework, did his due diligence, understood a lot of the details and the players and the intersection between the interests and the needs of himself, of the city, of the contractors, of the subcontractors. And it was really when he was building or actually creating his name. The only reason I wouldn't select Trump Tower as his best negotiation, although certainly it's his most well-known one, is that he engaged in some very significant puffery, if you will, in selling some of the properties within Trump Tower. And I think he went over the edge.
Oh yeah, no, he's got ethical lapses. All that's still there for him.
Right.
He lies about I think it's Princess Diana or something like that. He makes up all these other residents that are coming in.
Right.
So he's still himself. But I just want to unpack a couple of the things that we see. So one is, for listeners, we have this idea of negotiation called BATNA, which is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And so when you're in a negotiation, you're always thinking about, well, what if mine falls through? And so you want to have a strong BATNA so that if whatever you're negotiating, let's say that's a job offer, you have a strong BATNA if you have an equal job offer sitting in your back pocket. And then you're also thinking about your counterpart's BATNA. So do they have a strong alternative, or are their alternatives relatively weak? And you see in some areas here where he's, working to increase his BATNA, he's working to, effectively reduce the BATNA of his counterpart. And some of it runs into major ethical lapses, which, I guess we can have that part of the conversation. I'd like to put that part off for right now. But in terms of just the basic blocking and tackling of BATNA, you see him, working on several deals at once. He's actually doing some homework. Like, you get the feeling that he knows the main issues that are at stake. Something that we see later in his career, he hardly understands any issues in any kind of depth, which he does seem to understand in terms of, at least for the Trump Tower deal. What's your assessment on that? And feel free, please disagree with me on any of this. I don't pretend to hold the truth on this.
No, I agree with you with regard to some of his early deals. And there's a couple of issues I found in my research that Trump really had his finger on the pulse in terms of negotiations. One of them is leverage. As you point out, fundamental element of leverage is, what are you going to do if you don't do a deal with the other side? We traditionally call that, as you point out, our BATNAs. I tend to call it, in my negotiation training and teaching, Plan Bs. And the reason I do that is because I find that people tend to their eyes just tend to glaze over when we start using acronyms like BATNA.
Sure. Yeah, it's a bad acronym, but it's what we have.
but no, I think that, Donald Trump, had a very good appreciation in almost all of his deals as to what he wanted to do if he didn't do a deal with them. And in a lot of cases, the way to really strengthen and maximize your leverage, and Donald Trump did this very well over the years, is to take concrete, practical steps to develop a better Plan B. It's not just having another alternative job offer that's as good. Is taking steps at the same time you're working your one deal to try to get that other deal that you would do if you didn't do it. And Donald Trump talks about it as, keeping, many balls in the air, working on multiple deals at the same time. You never know when one of them is not going to go through. And he very much understood that was a fundamental area of negotiation. He also had a very keen understanding of the fact that leverage is not just what you're going to do if you don't do a deal with the other side, but what are they going to do if they don't do a deal with you? And he knew that he could have the ability to impact the other side's perception of what they would do if they don't do a deal with him. And he spent a lot of time and effort in trying to change those perceptions so that it gave him stronger leverage in those deals.
Right. So so a strong negotiator, it's a bit of game theory, right? A strong negotiator simultaneously thinking through all of their own options and backup options, and then how that will play out in a negotiation. And then also thinking through the perspective of the counterpart and all of their options and their backup options.
No, that's exactly right. And in fact, we not only think about those as alternatives, what you're going to do if you don't do a deal, but also as, I think, as you discussed, options as to different ways that we can do the deal with the other side and how we can actually increase our ability to accomplish our goals in that context.
As strong as we see some of his work there, I want to contrast that just with some of the basic concepts that we've discussed thus far. Let's think through the North Korea deal. So first of all, I'll let you, if you can just set us up with what was at stake, what was going on that led to the Trump-Kim Jong-un negotiation.
Okay, so the first summit that occurred, which is a little over a year ago now, between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, occurred because for 50-odd years, both Democrats and Republicans have tried to prevent North Korea from developing nuclear weapons capabilities. And both Democrats and Republicans over the years have been unsuccessful in doing that. In fact, Kim Jong-un and his father and his grandfather fairly successfully negotiated with the West over the last 40, 50 years. Over those years, they've wanted a number of things. They've wanted cash, they wanted food, they've wanted help developing civil nuclear capabilities. The West, both Democrats and Republicans, as well as non-U.S. actors, Japan, South Korea, other actors in the area, have wanted one thing, that North Korea would not develop nuclear weapons capabilities. Well, North Korea several years ago demonstrated an ability to detonate nuclear weapons. And that scared the heck out of everybody, as well it should have. And that prompted the Obama administration and President Obama, I think in his last meeting, maybe first meeting with incoming President Trump, to say that North Korea was going to be the biggest challenge that Donald Trump would face as president from a national security perspective. So keep in mind also that North Korea is one of the poorest countries in the world, but it's also one of the most authoritarian and dictatorial. And they treat their human rights record, by all accounts, is horrific. And one of the things that North Korea has wanted for many, many years is the opportunity to meet with the President of the United States and to be seen as a legitimate world leader on the world stage with the president. So that's the backdrop. When Donald Trump became president, he started communicating with Kim Jong-un basically through Twitter diplomacy, Twitter negotiation. And we saw some extremely adversarial tweets going back and forth between.
Yeah. So let me jump in. Let me jump in and read one of those. So just to set this up, in general, when heads of state communicate with one another, whether it doesn't matter if that's through Twitter or through official press release, or anything that's public, and you're dealing with nuclear weapons, the tone is always a 1 out of 10, flat, banal, really just no intonation whatsoever. And here's what Trump wrote: North Korean leader Kim Jong-un just stated that the nuclear button on his desk is at all times. Will someone from his depleted and food-starved regime please inform him that I too have a nuclear button, but it is a much bigger and much more powerful one than his, and my button works. So this is Trump's almost opening move, and when we talked about earlier, right? Trump has this capacity for ratcheting up emotions very quickly, very intensely, and this is his in many ways his opening statement to Kim Jong-un. What do you think about that as a opening move in terms of communication to set the stage for a negotiation?
Well, he's clearly personalizing and sending a shot across the bow of Kim Jong-un. It's very, very dangerous to use that type of tone when you're dealing with an admitted nuclear power. And actually, we do not have, despite the fact that we are the most powerful country in the world, we have relatively weak leverage vis-a-vis North Korea, which makes it even more dangerous to be communicating with the leader of another nuclear power in this way.
So normal leverage points would be especially sanctions, and our ability to sanction North Korea is very limited because we have almost no business dealings with North Korea before this. Even our counterparts have our allies have very limited business dealings with North Korea. We have no relations. There's no embassy. There's very few pressure points that we can put on North Korea to curb their behavior, with the exception of a strike.
Well, that's exactly right. Despite the fact that we have conventional power, more so than any country the world has ever seen, we need a deal. They don't appear to need a deal as much as we do. It's an authoritarian regime. And our alternative to a deal is not good. In fact,
let's think through both sides and their BATNA or their Plan B. And so first, let's step into the shoes of North Korea. Now, they have looked at what's happened to Muammar Gaddafi. They've looked at what's happened to Saddam Hussein as examples of what happens when you give up nuclear weapons. It doesn't look so good for you. And they now have these nuclear weapons. They're an oppressive regime with nuclear weapons. And what would it take? What does a no deal look like for them? What is their BATNA? It's really strong. No deal for them is very attractive, which just means keep their nuclear weapons. A no deal for them looks very attractive, which would be, well, you can just meet and get the photo op that you desire with the president of the United States that legitimizes a Kim Jong-un in front of the entire world. So the incentive structure on their side is such that it's hard to fathom what a deal would even look like for them, given how strong their BATNA or their Plan B is.
Well, but keep in mind, we do have leverage here. We're not powerless. Our leverage derives from our ability to get the world community on one page and to impose crippling economic sanctions, which is what the Obama administration did. And let me just make one more point about that, Jeff, which is that requires that we have China and Russia on the same page with regard to those crippling economic sanctions, because it's Russia and China that have the ability to stop economic assistance and trade to go into the North Korean regime. We do not have that independent power ourselves, but we do have that power if we can get allies on board from a world community perspective.
And so that pressure point, though, is really about China. So China is the number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 trading partner with North Korea. And it really involves an off-the-ball negotiation with China, which by all accounts had not happened. And the pressure point would be to convince China to produce crippling sanctions against North Korea. But that, too, is not in China's interest, because the last thing that China wants is a failed state on their border with refugees piling over the border into China.
Well, that's exactly right. Although we had pretty effective economic sanctions, my understanding is prior to the first summit between Kim Jong-un and President Trump, because China was somewhat at odds with Kim Jong-un, and they're playing a very delicate balancing act, because they are not thrilled to have a nuclear weapons capable neighbor right on their border. But if they shut those economic sanctions down too far, you're exactly right, Jeff. They've got a destabilized regime. They've got refugees coming off the border, and they got a big problem on their hands. But we had pretty tight economic sanctions prior to the summit. My understanding is that those economic sanctions, despite the fact that they're still on the books, that you don't have China on board nearly to the same extent. And that relates to a big difference between business negotiations and business zero-sum type negotiations that we were talking about earlier. in presidential negotiations where you've got multiple parties and multiple issues, because at the same time we're trying to get China to stay on the same page and keep those crippling economic sanctions on North Korea, all of a sudden President Trump starts a trade war with them. And all of a sudden we've got an inconsistent message being sent, and we've got real problems on our hands from an international negotiation perspective.
All right, so let's pull this back to goals and objectives within a negotiation. So we've gone through the reason why we might be skeptical about the pulling down the BATNA or the Plan B of North Korea, because they're going to want to keep their nuclear weapons. There's already models from U.S. foreign policy that says it's probably a good idea to keep your nuclear weapons if you can. The U.S.'s goal, right? So a U.S. goal is to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. And what does Trump do in order to make that a more likely outcome?
Well, first of all, Jeff, one of the big problems with the summit last June, the first summit between Kim Jong-un and President Trump, was they had an agreement to denuclearize, but they had two completely different understandings as to what the word denuclearize means, which is another problem sometimes in negotiations. You got to be on the same page with regard to whatever agreement you have, because if you don't, you've got ambiguity, you've got problems, and you create much bigger problems for yourself in the future. Right?
Agree.
So, the question then becomes, how do we somehow get them to denuclearize? And the first step that, from the West's perspective and the US's perspective, is we got to know what you've got. But in the supposed implementation of this denuclearization agreement, we never got any true insight and transparency into the nuclear weapons and the nuclear weapons capability that North Korea has, which should be telling us something about that alleged agreement.
One of the things that strikes me in terms of this negotiation, and then many of the others, is that for a very complex negotiation, what we should see is about a year or 2 years of back and forth on lower levels between the two entities, in this case, the United States and North Korea, and then a summit that is set up just for final stage negotiations. So all the building blocks are in place. They have a 400-page working document, and they just have a couple final things to get them over the finish line where Kim Jong-un and President Trump would meet in order to work through these things. That's not the Trump approach, right? The Trump approach is not detail-oriented. It's this belief that a negotiation takes place between two people, the heads of state or the heads of a company, and they'll wing it and figure it out on the spot instead of all of this incredible homework that has to happen beforehand. And so when you have these high-stakes negotiations where there's in reality going to be 1,000 different issues that are well beyond my expertise, dealing with the technicalities of nuclear weapons that are going to have to be hashed out. The idea that you're going to work through those in a 2 or 3 hour period is not very realistic.
Well, and one of the things that Donald Trump did very, very well in his early business career is he dug into the details and he did his homework. But then in the mid 1980s, he got caught up in his celebrity. And he stopped doing it. And he's taken that same sort of broad brush approach as president. And he also perceives, I believe, in the true power of personality and in that personality being somehow so persuasive and powerful that it's going to cause parties on the other side of the table to do things that they don't perceive to be in their self-interest. Well, in fact, that just doesn't happen in real life. Now, to give Donald Trump credit, all of that prep work and all the other stuff that had been done previously with North Korea, had led to some pretty significant agreements, all of which failed because North Korea cheated on them. So, I understand the impetus to try to accelerate it, to see if we can't achieve some breakthrough at the presidential, at the leader level, but there was no true understanding going into the summit what we could actually do and what type of detailed follow-up needed to be done to build on it. And all of a sudden, Trump came out of the summit saying, oh, we've got this fantastic agreement. We're all on the same page. We're buddies now. Well, you know what? that's not actually what happened. North Korea actually came out of that summit with a very big public relations win. They came out of it with a significant concession by Donald Trump that threw his allies, South Korea and Japan, under the bus when he said that we would stop our what he called war games, which was the North Koreans' description of what had happened, just in terms of our preparation with our allies. And all of a sudden, you don't have the type of follow-up or the prep work around that summit, and you can see what's happened since.
Yeah, I want to turn our attention to another area that's really interesting with Trump. So in many ways, Trump has turned how we think of a negotiation on its head and really makes us question and rethink so many different areas. He has this innate sense of tapping into people's emotions. There's a quote from Art of the Deal that says, "The final key to the way I promote is bravado. I play to people's fantasies. People may not always think big themselves, but they can still get very excited by those that do. That's why a little hyperbole never hurts. People want to believe that something is the biggest and the greatest and the most spectacular. I call it truthful hyperbole. It's an innocent form of exaggeration and a very effective form of promotion." What are your thoughts, having studied Trump, in terms of what he lays out in his own words in Art of the Deal, and then how that has played out with him as president?
Look, I think when you're in sales and you're in business, a little bit of exaggeration is expected, it's warranted, and people will understand that that's where you're coming from when you're in that environment. So when he's selling condos in Trump Tower, and he says, "This is the best ever. You'll never have a better view. We've got the best security that money has to offer." People take that and they understand that comes with somewhat of a grain of salt. He's in that sales environment. The problem is he has taken that same approach not only to politics but to the presidency. And when you're president, that has lasting and extremely negative ramifications. I also think that there's a difference between a little bit of truthful hyperbole, as he calls it, a little bit of exaggeration, what we call oftentimes in the negotiation world puffery. There is a very significant difference between a little bit of puffery and an intentional misrepresentation of a very important fact in a negotiation. And it does not appear, it doesn't appear, Donald Trump doesn't recognize the boundaries and the differences. And
I think it's all fluid. It feels very fluid to me. Truth and falsehood and in between. It seems, not in my words, I don't think it's fluid, but I think in his mind, it is very fluid.
Well, what he has been able to achieve in the marketing of his properties and in the business world with the news media to whom he has engaged is he has said certain things so many times that not only he believes it, but the public and some of his counterparts have also come to believe it. And
I want to turn to China and the current back and forth with the Chinese government. And from my perspective, just thinking through the power differences between what's happening with China versus that of North Korea. So the BATNA, the alternative for North Korea, was really strong, right? They had every reason to keep their nuclear weapons and not come to some serious deal. When we think through China right now, so Trump is raising tariffs on China on their. So they export $500 billion of goods to the United States. Trump recently announced an increase from 10% to 25% of tariffs on about $200 billion. China is retaliating in their own right on whiskey and some agricultural products. Their alternative, in fact, both sides' alternative on this is very different than the North Korean negotiation, right? So China has every reason to come to a deal eventually with the United States. Their BATNA of not having an agreement and suffering through increased tariffs when they export $500 billion to the United States and their economy is very dependent on the United States changes the negotiation dynamic that we should see at some point, who knows when, between the Trump administration and Premier Xi.
Well, you know what, Jeff, you put your finger on, I think, a really crucial element, which is who knows when. There's a short game and a long game here, and that's part of the problems that the U.S. has, which is even though China short term may be having some significant economic slowdown, some significant harm, they might be betting that longer term, 2 years, 3 years down the line, Donald Trump's not going to be president. And if that's the case, they might be figuring, hey, if we just hold out for another couple of years, we're going to play the long game. We've been in this for 5,000 years dealing with the West. Our alternative may not be as bad as y'all think it is.
Yeah, but so their BATNA changes, and this is why language is so important and why the tweet storm is self-defeating, which is in a business negotiation, you can think of things in terms of really one shareholder or a representative, which is going to be usually reduced to money. Right. So for a real estate deal, with few exceptions, the goal is going to be some bottom line financial interest. And that's just not the case with states. And so when you're negotiating or when you're talking with the head of another state, there's not necessarily just a dollar figure. They have elections, or in the Chinese case, they worry about a revolt from their people. They have to sell ideas back to their people, even if it's an authoritarian state. And so their BATNA shifts based on their public's perception. And so when Donald Trump tweets threatening messages to China, that ends up on their nationalized television stations and sent to the Chinese people, which makes it where the people are going to be less likely to support a negotiated deal on our timeline or on something that we want, or maybe on our terms, than if the communication was done in a much more corporate, professional way.
And if it's done in a more diplomatic way and not done publicly. There's a chapter in my book, The Real Trump Deal, on the differences between business negotiations and presidential negotiations. And there's really two different elements that Donald Trump really truly does not, I think, fully appreciate, because he's never been in elected office before he got elected president. One of, and perhaps the most important, is that you've got at the table negotiations and you've got behind the table negotiations. And the behind the table negotiations are exactly what you point out, which is that the Chinese leadership, even though it's an authoritarian state, still has to save face. They still have to have a certain level of public support. So when Donald Trump threatens or tweets a threat or acts like a bully, he makes it harder for them to agree with him rather than easier. And of course, he also has his behind the table negotiations. Some might say that he's doing this in order to rev up his base, which is his behind the table negotiations. But the problem is, by doing this, especially in a very public aggressive way, you create a much bigger disincentive for both parties to actually reach a deal. And you saw this early on, actually, when Donald Trump was going over to the summit with Kim Jong-un, because he just came out of the G8 meeting, and Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, had a press conference where he told his Canadian audience, hey, I stood up to Donald Trump, we're Canada strong. And Donald Trump saw that while he was on Air Force One flying to the east, or flying to the Far East, and he got very offended. He sent out some tweets saying some really, really nasty things about Justin Trudeau. And that sunk our relationship with one of our biggest trading partners to historic lows and made our ability to get a renegotiated NAFTA and everything else far less likely than more likely.
Yeah, let's look at this from the Chinese perspective. So they're also going to be thinking about these timelines and the Plan B or BATNA for the United States. And they will recognize that Trump, who uses the Dow Jones Industrial Average as his Nielsen rating, he views himself very much in terms of the stock market performance, that he's on a timeline, right? There's going to be an election in November of 2020, and the Trump is going to feel a tremendous amount of pressure for the stock market to be hitting new highs coming into election season. Premier Xi does not have those kind of time constraints. So they also might be viewing, right, the Trump's BATNA as being stronger right now, but potentially getting weak as the election approaches.
And they're trying to weaken it further by targeting their retaliatory tariffs on farmers and other actors who are viewed as Trump's base, because if he can make them feel the hurt of a trade war, their thought is that they'll be less likely to support him in November of 2020.
Yeah, I mean, I actually about to disagree a little bit. I mean, the Senate is stacked so heavy in farming states, whether it's Nebraska, Iowa, Montana, right? These low population states that have 2 senators, they'll get bills done that protect farmers is my prediction. But it could take a while to get there.
Well, it might, and don't forget, there are plenty of farmers in Wisconsin and Michigan and some other places. But even if they try to protect them, certainly the short-term perception is that they're hurting. And that's problematic for Donald Trump.
I'm just curious, what's attracted you to Trump? How did you get so obsessed? How did this become? I know you've been lecturing and writing on negotiations forever, but why this transition over to becoming the Trump expert?
Not quite forever, but thank you for that. After he was elected, I was sitting down with a colleague of mine. And he said, there's this public perception that Donald Trump, based on The Art of the Deal, based on The Apprentice, that he's a masterful negotiator. And someone asked me, they said, is he really a masterful negotiator based on the experts' proven research? They said, Marty, you've been studying this full time since 1998. How good is Donald Trump? And of course, I'd read Art of the Deal. And I have a keen interest in politics just as an observer, but I really didn't have an evidence-based answer to that question. And I looked around and really nobody had an evidence-based answer to that question. There were a couple of articles that were written as to whether or not he was a good negotiator, but nobody had really done any type of significant analysis of his business deals. And then I started looking into it and I realized that no business person that I'm aware of over the last 40, 50 years has been as transparent about what they have done in their negotiations as Donald Trump. He's talked to everybody about it. There have been like 8 extensively researched investigative biographies about him where he's talked about his negotiations. Now, nobody really talks about their negotiations, but he did.
It's one of my, by the way, it's why I actually use Trump. I use sections from Art of the Deal to teach negotiation. Not because I think of him as a master. It's just, it's impossible to find people that open up about when they use deception and when they manipulate the media and when they use unethical means. And Trump is out there talking about it.
And not only was he out there talking about it, but if you can believe this, Jeff, Donald Trump, over his 40-plus year business career, has been involved in over 4,000 pieces of litigation. So we have testimony under oath by almost all of his counterparts and by him relating to what happened in his negotiations, which is unprecedented. So I had that basic raw research that could guide me in making an evaluation as to whether or not he was a good negotiator or a bad negotiator.
So what's your conclusion?
Other than recommending that all your listeners buy my book?
Yeah.
Early on, he did some very well-balanced deals. But as I mentioned before, as he got caught up in his celebrity, he stopped doing his homework. He stopped doing his due diligence. And he ended up in 1990 with $2 billion of debt. $833.5 million of it was personally guaranteed. And he was worth, according to an independent financial analyst hired by over 30 banks to whom he owed money, he was worth a minus $295 million. He overpaid by tens of millions of dollars for the Plaza Hotel in New York. He overpaid by tens of millions of dollars for the Eastern Air Shuttle. So while he was a pretty good negotiator early on, he really hasn't done his homework for many, many years. And he has felt that by force of personality, somehow people would agree to do things with him. And that is simply not the case. And we've seen that since he's been president.
So he's no Henry Kissinger?
He is no Henry Kissinger.
Another question. Why hasn't Mexico paid for the wall?
Because Donald Trump did not explore a creative way to accomplish that goal. Now, some people would say they were never going to pay for the wall. And I think it's accurate to say that they would never admit to paying for a wall. But if Donald Trump had really done his homework well, I think he could have incorporated some elements of wall building into the renegotiation of NAFTA. And had he done that, we in the U.S. had significant leverage with regard to the renegotiation of NAFTA. I think he could have gotten Mexico to pay for some portion of a wall, although they would never publicly admit it because, of course, that way they would lose face and they could never maintain any type of public confidence in themselves would they admit it. But I think that Donald Trump actually could have made that happen had he been creative and understanding enough concerning that particular negotiation.
All right. Well, we're about out of time. I just want to thank you. This has been a lot of fun. This is the topic of everybody's conversation. Even if it's not negotiations and Trump, but it's very much on everybody's mind. And this has been an amazing conversation.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate joining you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffshatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.